It was the summer after sophomore year when everything changed. The old Victorian house on Maple Street had stood for nearly a century, its weathered facade hiding secrets within its walls that none of us could have imagined. 3 stories tall with peeling paint and creaking floorboards, it was the kind of place that felt alive, breathing with history and memories. The attic bedroom, with its sloped ceilings and dormer windows, was both the most coveted and the most feared space in the house. When the 5 of us signed the lease, it was clear that 2 would need to share that space. The largest bedroom, but also the most isolated, tucked away beneath the eaves where summer heat collected and winter drafts crept through invisible cracks. I still remember the day we drew straws to decide who would get which rooms. My heart raced as I pulled the short straw along with Alex. We'd been friends since freshman orientation, not best friends, but the kind of comfortable acquaintances who could share a pizza and conversation without awkward silences. He was tall and lanky with perpetually tousled dark hair and a smile that seemed to hide something behind it. I was shorter, more reserved, the kind of person who preferred books to parties but was trying desperately to break out of my shell in college. "Looks like we're attic buddies," Alex said with that half-smile of his, clapping me on the shoulder as the others, Mike, Damon, and Trevor, celebrated their single-room victories on the second floor. I nodded, trying to match his enthusiasm while wondering how we'd manage to coexist in a space that would force us into constant proximity. We'd never shared a room before, never seen each other's morning faces or listened to each other's sleep breathing. The thought sent a flutter of anxiety through my chest that I couldn't quite name. The attic bedroom was a long rectangle with a ceiling that peaked in the middle and sloped dramatically down on either side. 2 dormer windows punctuated each end, offering views of the tree-lined street and the overgrown backyard. The room was divided naturally by the central beam, creating 2 mirror image spaces that would become our respective territories for the next academic year. Let me explain why this division mattered so much. In a shared space, these invisible boundaries become sacred, the only semblance of privacy in a world where everything else is communal. We carried our belongings up the narrow staircase that day, sweating in the August heat as box after box made the journey to what would become our home. The question hung between us, unspoken but unavoidable: who would take which side? The sides weren't identical, despite the symmetrical appearance. The left side had the better window view, overlooking the ancient oak tree whose branches sometimes scraped against the glass during storms. The right side was closer to the small bathroom we'd share, with better access to the lone electrical outlet that wasn't controlled by the ancient wall switch. "Which side do you want?" I finally asked as we stood in the empty room, our shadows stretching across the wooden floorboards. I was trying to be polite, to start this new living arrangement on the right foot. But deep down, I hoped he'd choose the right side, leaving me with the view of the oak tree and the morning light that would filter through its leaves. Alex walked the perimeter of the room, running his hand along the sloped ceiling, testing the windows, and checking the closet spaces. "I'll take this side," he said finally, pointing to the left, my preferred side. "If that's cool with you?" I nodded, swallowing my disappointment. "Yeah, that's fine. It was just a side of a room, after all. What did it matter?" But as we began arranging furniture and unpacking boxes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened. He had chosen against me, not maliciously, not even knowingly, but the choice felt weighted with meaning I couldn't articulate. The first few weeks passed in a blur of new classes and establishing routines. We danced around each other in the mornings, politely taking turns in the bathroom, keeping our music low, and respecting the invisible line that divided the room. But living with someone reveals things that casual friendship never could. I learned that Alex talked in his sleep, sometimes full conversations with people who weren't there. He discovered that I was obsessively neat, aligning my books by height and color-coding my calendar. These intimate details should have brought us closer, but instead, they seemed to highlight our differences. His side of the room became increasingly chaotic as the semester progressed. Clothes draped over chairs, textbooks open on the floor, coffee mugs collecting on the windowsill. My side remained meticulously organized, a fortress of order against the encroaching chaos. The central beam between us began to feel less like a dividing line and more like a border between 2 countries with vastly different cultures. "Do you mind if Trevor and Mike come over to watch the game tonight?" Alex asked one Saturday in October, already moving his desk chair to make room for visitors. Actually, I have a paper due Monday, I replied, gesturing to my laptop where I'd been working for hours. Could you maybe watch in the common room? Something flickered across his face, annoyance, perhaps, or disappointment. Sure, no problem. Wouldn't want to disturb the perfect study environment. There was an edge to his voice I hadn't heard before. What's that supposed to mean? I asked, immediately defensive. Alex shrugged. Nothing. Just that some people know how to relax sometimes. He grabbed his phone and headed for the door, leaving me alone in the suddenly too quiet room. That was the first crack in our polite coexistence, the first acknowledgement that something wasn't working between us. I stared at the empty doorway long after he'd gone, wondering why his words had stung so much. Was I too uptight? Was he too careless? Or was there something else entirely happening beneath the surface of our interactions? The tension grew as autumn deepened into winter. Small irritations became magnified. His alarm going off multiple times each morning, my insistence on lights out by midnight, his friends dropping by unannounced, my passive-aggressive notes about the bathroom schedule. We were like two planets in the same orbit, constantly aware of each other's presence, but unable to synchronize our rotations. December brought finals and the heightened stress that accompanies them. The attic grew colder as winter settled in, forcing us to add layers of blankets to our beds and wear hoodies indoors. One particularly frigid night, I woke to the sound of the oak tree's branches scraping against Alex's window, a rhythmic scratching that had become familiar but now seemed unusually loud. Through the darkness, I could see him sitting up in bed, staring out at the storm. "You okay?" I asked, my voice thick with sleep. He turned, surprised. "Yeah, just thinking." A pause. Then, "Do you ever feel like you're living the wrong life?" The question hung in the cold air between us, unexpected and profound. I sat up too, pulling my blanket around my shoulders. "What do you mean?" "Like you're following a script someone else wrote. Doing what you're supposed to do instead of what you want." He wasn't looking at me, but at some point beyond the window glass, beyond the thrashing tree branches. Sometimes, I admitted, surprised by my own honesty. More often than I'd like to admit. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, we actually talked. Not about bathroom schedules or noise levels or personal space, but about the things that kept us awake at night. Alex confessed that he was failing calculus and afraid to tell his parents, who were paying his tuition and expected him to follow his father into engineering. I shared my own fears about choosing a practical major instead of pursuing writing, which had been my passion since childhood. As the night deepened around us, the invisible line between our sides of the room seemed to blur. We were just two people trying to figure out our paths, united by the universal uncertainty of early adulthood. When dawn finally broke, casting pale light through the frost-edged windows, something had shifted between us. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough to feel like the beginning of a change. The winter break separated us for 3 weeks. I went home to my parents' house in Connecticut, while Alex flew to California to visit his brother. We didn't text or call. We weren't that kind of friends, but I found myself wondering what he was doing, whether he was enjoying the West Coast sunshine, whether he was thinking about the conversation we'd had during the storm. When we returned in January, the attic bedroom felt different, smaller somehow, or perhaps more intimate. Alex had brought back a poster from a San Francisco art gallery, abstract shapes in blues and greens, which he hung on his side of the room. I'd returned with a new plant, a small jade succulent that I placed on my windowsill where it could catch the winter light. "How was your break?" he asked as we unpacked, his voice casual, but his eyes more attentive than before. "Good. Quiet. Yours?" "Interesting." He smiled, that half-smile that had always seemed mysterious but now felt more like an invitation. "My brother introduced me to some of his artist friends. Made me think about some things differently." I wanted to ask what things, how differently, but something held me back. The same something that had been creating distance between us all along. Instead, I nodded and continued arranging my books, aware of him watching me from across the room. February brought record snowfall that buried the campus in drifts taller than mailboxes. Classes were canceled for 3 days straight, trapping everyone in their residences. The 5 of us in the house played board games by candlelight during a power outage, drank too much cheap wine, and shared stories we might never have told with electricity humming around us. When Mike, Damon, and Trevor eventually fell asleep on the living room couches. Alex and I made our way back up to the attic, navigating the dark staircase by the light of our phones. The room was freezing, our breath visible in the dim light. Without discussion, we pushed our beds to the center of the room, directly beneath the peak of the ceiling where the heat rose, and piled all our blankets together. We lay there, not touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth, staring up at the shadows playing across the wooden beams. "Why did you choose that side of the room?" I asked suddenly, the question I'd been holding back since move-in day finally escaping. Alex was quiet for so long I thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, "The tree," he said. "I liked watching it move in the wind. Reminded me of this oak we had in our backyard when I was a kid." Another pause. "Why? Did you want this side?" "Yeah," I admitted, feeling foolish now for the months of resentment over something so small. "For the same reason, actually. The tree." He laughed, a soft sound in the darkness. "We could have just talked about it." "We could have talked about a lot of things," I said, surprising myself with my boldness. The silence that followed wasn't awkward but weighted with possibility. I could feel something changing in that space between us, something that had been evolving since that stormy December night. "I didn't choose against you," Alex said finally, his voice quiet but clear. "That day when we picked sides, I just chose for myself. There's a difference." His words hit me with unexpected force, illuminating months of misunderstanding. I had interpreted his choice as a rejection, a statement about our relationship, when it had simply been a preference for a view that held personal meaning. How many other interactions had I filtered through my own insecurities, seeing opposition where there was only individual choice? "I know that now," I said, and meant it. The power came back on the next day, and campus gradually dug itself out from under the snow. Life resumed its normal rhythms, but something fundamental had changed in our attic bedroom. The invisible line remained. We still had our own sides, our own spaces, but it no longer felt like a barrier. We started studying together sometimes, sharing music recommendations, even occasionally joining each other's friend groups for meals or movies. One evening in late March, as spring was just beginning to hint at its arrival, I returned to the room to find Alex sitting on my bed, holding my journal. My heart stopped, then raced. That journal contained thoughts I'd never spoken aloud, including confused feelings about Alex himself that had been growing since our snowbound night. "Before you freak out," he said, holding up his hands, "I didn't read it. It fell when I was borrowing your charger, and I was just putting it back." I believed him. We'd built enough trust by then. But the moment had created an opening I wasn't sure how to navigate. I sat beside him, taking the journal and placing it safely in my drawer. "Would it be bad if you had read it?" he asked, his voice careful. I looked at him then, really looked at him, at the person who had become so much more than just a roommate over these months. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "There are things in there I'm still figuring out." "About me?" His directness surprised me. I nodded, unable to find words. "I've been figuring things out too," he said, his eyes holding mine. "About what I want, who I want." The air between us seemed to vibrate with unspoken possibilities. This was the turning point, the moment when everything could change or retreat back into comfortable ambiguity. I took a breath, gathering courage. "And what have you figured out?" I asked. Instead of answering with words, Alex leaned forward slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. When his lips met mine, it felt like the most natural conclusion to the story we'd been writing together since that first day in the attic. The remaining weeks of the semester unfolded with the heady intensity of new love combined with the comfortable foundation of friendship. We still maintained our separate sides of the room. Some habits were too ingrained to break, but the central space became shared territory, a place where we met in the middle. The oak tree outside his window became our tree, its spring buds and eventual leafy canopy marking the passage of time in our evolving relationship. Not everything was perfect. We still argued about his messiness and my rigidity. We still had different friends and different interests. But we had learned to talk through these differences instead of letting them fester into resentment. We had learned that choosing for yourself doesn't have to mean choosing against someone else. As May approached, and with it the end of the academic year, we faced new questions. Would we request to be roommates again next year? Would we tell our housemates about the change in our relationship? What would happen over the summer when we returned to homes hundreds of miles apart? One night, as we lay together watching the moonlight create patterns on the sloped ceiling, I asked the question that had been on my mind. Do you regret choosing that side of the room? Alex turned to face me, his expression thoughtful. No, he said finally. I think we needed that space between us at first. I think we needed to choose our own sides before we could choose each other. I understood what he meant. That initial division, which had felt so personal and painful, had actually given us room to grow into ourselves before growing toward each other. The attic bedroom, with its peaked ceiling and sloped walls, had shaped our relationship in ways neither of us could have anticipated. As the year drew to a close and we packed our belongings into boxes once again, I found myself lingering in the empty room, running my hand along the central beam that had once seemed like such an insurmountable barrier. The room would house new students next year, who would create their own territories and boundaries, their own stories within these walls. Alex appeared in the doorway, the last of his boxes in his arms. Ready? He asked. I nodded, taking one final look at the space that had witnessed our transformation from reluctant roommates to something much more. The attic bedroom had taught us that sometimes the divisions we perceive most strongly exist primarily in our own minds. That choosing a side doesn't have to mean taking a side against someone else. And that sometimes, the most important journeys happen in the smallest of spaces, under sloped ceilings, with the sound of oak branches tapping against the window like a reminder that life is constantly in motion, constantly changing, constantly offering new beginnings for those brave enough to reach for them. As we descended the narrow staircase together, I realized that home wasn't about which side of a room you claimed. It was about the people who made any space feel like somewhere you belonged. Alex had chosen the side against me that first day, but in the end, he had chosen to stand beside me in all the ways that truly mattered. Total _char_count, 18,642.